The metal tray hit the stainless steel table with a sharp, echoing clang that felt louder than it actually was. I didn't look up at the three men standing across from me, but I could feel the weight of their silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of coworkers sharing a rhythm. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that tells you exactly where you stand in a room. I reached for the next stack of industrial-sized plates, my movements deliberate and steady. I knew they were watching me. I knew they were waiting for me to fumble, to ask another question they could ignore, or to provide them with another reason to smirk behind their hands. When I first walked into this production facility 3 weeks ago, I had that naive, new job energy. I expected the usual learning curve, the awkward first-week introductions, and maybe a few jokes at the expense of the new guy. What I didn't expect was a wall of cold, calculated exclusion that seemed to start the moment I clocked in. It began with the training. I'd stand there, hands ready, asking a simple question about the conveyor speed or the sorting order, and the lead trainer, Arjun, would simply turn his head. He wouldn't look at me. He'd look through me, then turn to one of the other guys and start a rapid-fire conversation in Punjabi. I'd stand there for 30 seconds, then a minute, feeling the heat rise in my neck. I wasn't a ghost, but they were certainly trying to make me feel like one. The only time they acknowledged my presence was when they needed to label me. To them, I wasn't the new hire, or the guy who'd spent 10 years in logistics, or even just another worker on the floor. I was just white boy. They didn't even try to lower their voices. They'd say it with a specific tilt of the head, a dismissive wave of the hand that made the words feel like a physical shove. It wasn't just the name-calling, it was the tactical use of language. The facility has a strict English-only policy on the production floor for safety and coordination. It's written in the handbook, posted on the break room walls and mentioned in every morning briefing. But for Arjan and his inner circle, those rules didn't seem to apply. They used their language like a fence, building it up around me, so I was always on the outside looking in. They would stand 3 feet away from me, look me dead in the eye, and then begin a long, animated discussion while laughing. I didn't need a translator to know they were talking about me. The tone, the glances, the way they'd pause to see if I was reacting. It was a performance designed to make me feel small. I tried to be the bigger person for the first 2 weeks. I really did. I'd wait for them to finish, then ask again in a calm, professional voice if they could explain the next step in English so I could do my job correctly. Arjun would just shrug, offer a half-hearted sentence that barely answered the question, and walk away. It was a slow-motion hazing that started to eat at me. I'd go home and sit in my car for 10 minutes before even starting the engine, just trying to shake off the feeling of being an intruder in my own life. The breaking point didn't come with a shout or a confrontation. It came during a shift change when I overheard them complaining to the floor manager. I have a decent grasp of French enough to hold my own, and a few days prior I'd started speaking it under my breath or to a French-speaking colleague just to reclaim some sense of self. Arjan had gone to the boss, claiming that my use of French was making them feel uncomfortable and that it was rude to speak a language others didn't understand. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. They wanted the monopoly on exclusion. They wanted to be the only ones with a secret code. Today, however, the schedule changed. Usually I was tucked away in the back, doing the heavy lifting where I was easily ignored. But today, the shift lead assigned me to the main conveyor line, loading dishes. I was paired with Sarah, one of the few people who had actually been kind to me. She gave me a quick nod and a sympathetic smile as we took our positions at the head of the belt. At the other end of the long, rattling stainless steel line were Arjun and his right-hand man. Their job was to take the dishes off as fast as we put them on, stack them, and prep them for the next stage. It was a simple flow-and-catch system. If we went too fast, they'd get overwhelmed. If they went too slow, the belt would jam. For the first hour, I kept a standard pace. I watched how Sarah moved, mirroring her rhythm. I could see Arjun and Deep at the far end, moving with a lazy, arrogant sort of confidence. They had their wireless earbuds in, a clear violation of safety protocols, and they were leaning against the stacks, checking their phones every few minutes. They thought they had the rhythm mastered. They thought they could dictate the speed of the day, just like they dictated the social climate of the floor. Then the music changed. I had my own headphones in. The over-the-ear kind allowed for certain zones, and a high-tempo, heavy bass track kicked in. I felt a sudden sharp shift in my internal gears. It wasn't just the music, it was the 2 weeks of being called white boy, the 2 weeks of being ignored, the 2 weeks of being the punchline of jokes I wasn't allowed to understand. I didn't say a word, I just started moving. I reached for the stacks with a fluidity I hadn't realized I possessed. Pick, place, slide, pick, place, slide. My hands were moving in a blur, but the movements were precise. I wasn't just putting dishes on the belt, I was spacing them perfectly, barely an inch between each one. It was a solid, continuous stream of porcelain and plastic. Sarah looked at me, her eyes widening. She didn't slow me down, she just stepped back a bit, letting me take the lead. She saw what I was doing. She knew the tension that had been building, and she just stepped out of the way of the landslide. Down at the other end, the atmosphere changed instantly. I could see the moment the first wave of the high-speed line reached them. Arjun reached out to grab a tray, but before he could even set it down, 3 more were already there. He had to pivot faster. Then Deep had to drop his phone into his pocket and scramble to help. I didn't break a sweat. I felt a strange cold clarity. Every time I saw them stumble, every time Arjun had to break his cool, effortless posture to lung for a falling plate, I felt a little bit of that weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't complaining to the boss. I was just doing my job exceptionally well. The beauty of the conveyor system is that it doesn't lie. It's a mechanical record of effort. By the second hour, the belt was a solid wall of moving dishes. Arjun and Deep were no longer leaning. They were sweating. Their movements were frantic, jerky, and desperate. They were no longer talking in Punjabi. They didn't have the breath for it. They were struggling to keep their heads above water, and I was the one holding the hose. I watched them out of the corner of my eye. Arjun looked up once, his face red, his eyes darting to me with a look of pure venom. I didn't acknowledge him. I just reached for another stack and increased the pace by 5%. I wanted to see exactly where their breaking point was. About 3 hours into the shift, the inevitable happened. The line backed up so badly at their end that the sensors triggered a safety halt. The entire conveyor grinded to a screeching stop. The sudden silence in the hall was deafening. A few minutes later, the team lead, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, came marching down from the mezzanine. She looked at the digital readout on the main terminal, then looked at the line. Our section, which usually sat in the middle of the pack for productivity, had spiked into a range the building hadn't seen in months. But because the end of the line couldn't handle the volume, the overall output had plummeted. Brenda walked up to me first. I was standing there, hands at my sides, looking as calm as if I'd just finished a light stroll. "What's the holdup here?" she asked, her voice sharp over the hum of the nearby machinery. I looked at her, then looked at the empty belt in front of me. "I don't know, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice neutral and slightly confused. "I've just been putting them on. The belt keeps stopping on me. I've got no space to keep loading until it moves again. I've just been standing here waiting." She looked at the stacks of unwashed dishes behind me, then looked at the jam-packed chaos at the far end where Arjun and Deep were trying to reorganize the mountain of porcelain they'd failed to stack. Brenda didn't say another word to me. She turned on her heel and stormed down to the other end. I couldn't hear the specifics of what she said, but I didn't need to. Her body language spoke volumes. She was pointing at their pockets, where their phones were clearly visible, and then at the tangled mess of plates. For the next 2 hours, Brenda didn't leave. She stood there with a clipboard, literally babysitting them. She made them take out their earbuds. She made them leave their phones in their lockers. She watched every single movement they made, her presence a heavy looming shadow over their workstations. I meanwhile continued at my new pace. Now that the line was moving again, I kept the pressure on. Every time Arjun looked like he was about to catch his breath, I'd send a particularly dense run of heavy trays down his way. I watched him struggle under the gaze of the team lead, his ego bruising with every fumble. He looked slow. He looked lazy. He looked like he couldn't handle the basic requirements of the job he'd been doing for years. When the lunch whistle finally blew, I felt more energized than I had in weeks. I walked toward the break room, passing Arjan and Deep. They were both drenched in sweat, their faces set in grim, exhausted masks. They didn't call me white boy this time. They didn't say anything at all as I passed them. I sat down at a table in the corner, opening my lunch bag. I pulled out a hamburger I'd prepped the night before and pulled up a video on my phone. I was halfway through a bite when I felt the air in the room shift. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. The shadow fell across my table first. "Slow down," Arjan said. His voice was low, strained and stripped of all its usual bravado. I finished chewing, took a slow sip of my water, and then looked up. I didn't smile, I didn't look angry. I just looked at him with the same blank expression he'd given me for 3 weeks. "Excuse me?" I asked. "You heard me," he snapped, leaning in closer. His eyes were bloodshot from the strain of the morning. "You're going too fast. You're making it impossible. Slow it down this afternoon." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I don't think so, Arjan. I'm just finding my groove." The team lead seemed really happy with my productivity. In fact, she mentioned it in the hallway. Why would I want to do a worse job just because you can't keep up? His jaw tightened so hard I thought I heard it click. Deep was standing behind him, looking equally miserable. "You think you're smart?" Arjan hissed. "You think this is funny?" I didn't answer right away. I just went back to my video. A faint smile finally touching my lips as I watched the screen. It sucks to suck, I thought, but I didn't say it. I didn't need to. The fact that he was standing there, pleading with the guy he'd spent weeks trying to break, was enough of a victory. They stood there for another few seconds, mean-mucking me, trying to use their physical presence to intimidate me. But the power dynamic had shifted. You can't intimidate the guy who is currently outworking you in front of the boss. They eventually turned and walked away, muttering to each other. But the rhythm of their conversation was different. It wasn't the confident banter of the playground bullies anymore. It was the frantic whispering of people who knew they were in trouble. Later that afternoon, I ran into Raj, a guy from the packaging department who I'd struck up a quiet friendship with. He spoke Punjabi fluently and had seen the whole drama unfold from his station. He leaned in as we passed each other in the supply closet. "They got written up," he whispered, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Brenda put it in the system. Official warning for phone use and safety violations with the earbuds. They're furious, man. They're saying you're doing it on purpose." I just shrugged. "I'm just doing my job, Raj. If they can't handle the pace of a white boy, maybe they're in the wrong profession." Raj chuckled and shook his head. "Just be careful. They aren't used to people pushing back. I appreciated the warning, but I wasn't worried. The fear I'd felt during those first 2 weeks, the fear of not fitting in, of being the outcast, had evaporated. It had been replaced by a cold, hard sense of competence. I realized that their exclusion only worked if I cared about being included in their circle. And I didn't. I cared about my paycheck, my reputation with the management, and my own sense of self-respect. As the shift wound down, we had our daily debrief. We all gathered in a semicircle near the main office. Brenda stood in the center, her eyes scanning the group. "I want to point something out before we head out," she said, her voice echoing in the now quiet warehouse. "We had some issues with the main line today, some bottlenecks that shouldn't have happened. We've addressed those. But I also want to highlight some excellent work." She looked directly at me. "Our new hire here hit a loading rate that we haven't seen in this building in over a year. He stayed consistent, he kept his head down, and he pushed the line. That's the kind of energy I want to see from everyone. If the loading can happen that fast, there's no reason the takeoff should be lagging. Good job today." I nodded once, a simple professional acknowledgement. I didn't look at Arjun, but I could feel the heat radiating off him from 3 feet away. The silence from his side of the circle was absolute. The final touch, however, wasn't on the production floor. It was at the end of the day, when we all headed out to the employee shuttle bus that takes us to the main transit hub. I'd noticed over the last few weeks that Arjan and Deep had a specific ritual. They always sat in the very back row, the same 2 seats every single day. It was their throne room. The place where they sat and surveyed the rest of us, speaking their private language and laughing at whoever they chose. Today, I didn't linger at my locker. I didn't stop to chat. I headed straight for the exit, my bag slung over my shoulder. I was the first one on the bus. I walked straight to the back. I sat down in Aryan's usual seat, placed my heavy work bag in Deep's usual spot, and leaned my head back against the window. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the other workers boarding. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy footsteps I'd grown to recognize. The bus shifted slightly as they stepped on. I didn't open my eyes, but I felt them stop right next to me. There was a long, pregnant pause. I could imagine them standing there, looking at my bag, then at me, then at the empty seats further down the bus. In the past, I might have moved. I might have apologized and found somewhere else to sit, just to avoid the friction. Not today. I didn't move an inch. I didn't even pretend to be asleep. I just kept my eyes closed, breathing rhythmically, letting them feel the absolute weight of my indifference. Eventually, I heard a low, hissed curse in Punjabi, and the sound of them moving toward the middle of the bus. They sat in the cramped seats near the wheel, the ones they usually mocked. As the bus pulled out of the lot, I finally opened my eyes and looked out the window. The sunset was hitting the industrial park, turning the gray concrete into something almost beautiful. I felt a quiet, steady sense of peace. It wasn't a grand revenge. I hadn't gotten them fired. I hadn't started a fight. I had simply stopped playing by the rules they had written. I had used the only thing that truly matters in a place like this, the work to draw a line in the sand. I knew tomorrow would be more of the same. They would probably try to sabotage my line, or find new ways to ignore me, or escalate their complaints. But the dynamic had been permanently altered. They knew I could outwork them. They knew I could outmaneuver them. And most importantly, they knew that the white boy wasn't afraid of them anymore. I watched the trees flash by. As we hit the highway, my mind already drifting toward what I was going to have for dinner. The stress that had been coiled in my stomach for weeks had finally unraveled. I realized then that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who wants you to feel unwelcome is to make yourself indispensable. Before we go on, I want to hear your take. Who do you think is actually in the wrong here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. But for now, let's get back to the story. I reached into my bag, pulled out a sandwich I'd saved, and took a large, satisfied bite. I didn't look back at the middle of the bus. I didn't need to see their faces to know that, for the first time since I'd started this job, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The bus hit a bump, and I felt the solid, heavy frame of the vehicle beneath me. I thought about the days ahead, the long shifts, the constant hum of the conveyor. I knew I'd be tired. I knew my hands would ache. But as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, I didn't see the ghost they'd tried to make me. I saw someone who had found his footing, and I knew that no matter how fast they talked or how loud they laughed, they wouldn't be able to shake me off that line again. The silence in the back of the bus was finally the right kind of silence. It was mine,